This is the currency of the resistance. What is Bitcoin?
Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. Those are the words spoken by Bitcoin in the Genesis block. Those are the first words of To the Moon with Max and Stacy.
Right. This is the historic headline that was in the Times of London, which was coded into the Genesis block that, of course, appeared on January 3rd, 2009. Is it a reference to the purpose of Bitcoin to disrupt the banking system, or was it just a random headline to try to date when the Genesis block was born? One of the mysteries of Bitcoin that we still debate today.
Was that the beginning of the story, January 3rd, 2009, or was it October 31st, 2008, when the Satoshi white paper was published, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system? Was that the beginning? Was it the cypherpunks 20, 30 years previously? When did Bitcoin really begin?
I think it really began on January 3rd, 2009, because that's when they pushed the code into the production environment, onto the internet. And that's when we got a first look to see whether or not this thing was going to work. This was the moment. This is the Genesis block, and it's called the Genesis block for a reason.
What is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is magic internet money.
Bitcoin is a new type of digital currency.
Bitcoin is decentralized digital scarcity.
To me, Bitcoin is unconfiscatable and censorship-resistant value transfer.
Bitcoin is civil disobedience.
Fundamentally, I believe it's just a new way of coming to consensus about things.
To me, it's a game changer in the human history.
Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer system for value transfer. To many people, it's money. And to me, it is a source of optimism because I can control my own financial destiny and not be beholden to a financial system that has proven itself to be unstable and unfair.
Every single person we ask, what is Bitcoin, has a different answer. For Satoshi Nakamoto, it seems that his choice of those first words embedded in the Genesis block had to have a message about what he thought Bitcoin was about. Not that his point of view is any more important or relevant than any other person's point of view involved in Bitcoin.
A really important stage in Bitcoin's history was a group of people who tried to take over Bitcoin and tried to dilute Bitcoin of its political intent by saying it's a politically neutral technology. But what Satoshi put inside of the Genesis block was a very clear message that nobody could really argue against, which was a message about the bailing out of the central banks by the governments. They tried to say Satoshi was not a libertarian, but it was very clear from the Genesis block, the very first block in the entire Bitcoin system, that that was what Bitcoin was about. That was who he was.
Of course, Satoshi Nakamoto is anonymous, so we don't know who the creator of Bitcoin really is. But his name is interesting because I'm from Japan, so I can understand what that means. So his name Satoshi. Satoshi is to enlighten, and Nakamoto is Naka is inside, and Moto is a book. So inside the book, there is a force that enlightens us.
It's difficult to discern exactly what Satoshi was after, but from all of his writings and from his software code, it appears that Satoshi wanted a world where individuals had their own private keys to their own money, and did it in a way that it was censorship resistant. His birthday, for example, has to do with when gold was seized with Executive Order 6102, and when it was re-legalized in 1975. The Genesis block talks about the Chancellor on the brink for these bailouts. So Satoshi, I think, wanted a world where we have personal responsibility, where we have sound money, where things are being operated in accordance with natural law and the laws of economics, not political dogma.
Satoshi, I think, wanted financial inclusion, access to a peer-to-peer network where nobody can tell you what to do with your money. I wanted to break the chains of financial slavery that have been around for thousands of years.
Satoshi wanted a money that is not controlled by a centralized party. A good store of value, a way to preserve wealth over time. A lot of people argue that he was aiming for a better method of payment. And to some degree, that might be true, but a large part of what Satoshi wanted from his writings on Bitcoin Talk and so on is a much better gold, a much better store of value. And that's what Bitcoin has been. And that's where Bitcoin is, hands down way better than every other store of value that's ever existed.
The Genesis block is not including an article about how it's difficult to buy coffee with a credit card. It's including an article about a central bank bailing out a commercial bank in the context of monetary expansion and economical cycles. So Bitcoin is a monetary policy revolution, but still you can find basically the classical references in Satoshi discussion about the quest of cypherpunk people for electronic cash, a private dark money that you can use without being spied upon or without being censored, and the quest for sound money, which is not easy to manipulate and to inflate.
So no matter what Satoshi Nakamoto wanted, whatever he wanted would not have been possible to realize without all the predecessors before him, without the likes of Nick Szabo, Adam Back, David Chaum, Timothy May, Eric Hughes, and John Gilmore, the famous image of them on Wired magazine. These are the cypherpunks. Their ideas, their philosophy, and their ideology were important. And without those ideas already in the mix, just like the American Revolution and the French Revolutions, there were ideas explored for decades before the revolution could suddenly erupt.
Well, I'll make an analogy to Allen Ginsberg's Howl, right? I mean, this was a screech from the pit of humanity. These guys, cypherpunks, are employed by the oppressors, their surveillance state, governments, but they clung to their humanity, and they were able to pass encryption to the public by using the Constitution, famously. And now with Bitcoin, they're passing value and the creation of trade to the masses.
The cypherpunks started working on concepts of digital money in the late 80s, early 90s, and there were quite a few people in the space who had what seemed to be promising ideas, but ultimately were found to have deep critical failures in them. And so the interesting thing about Bitcoin is that Satoshi didn't really create anything fundamentally new, but rather Satoshi managed to look around at the space, see all of the developments that had happened, and cherry pick a few things, put them together in a way that had never been done before, and as a result, create a much more robust system than anything that had ever been designed.
Well, Bitcoin was essentially born out of cypherpunk ideals, right? It's like privacy is the ultimate mechanism of freedom, right? I mean, Orwell really understood that. And without privacy, you can't be free. You can't criticize the government. You can't do anything, right, in your life. It's fascinating how much you need that, and how little people appreciate it. Bitcoin gives you all those features, the privacy, the freedom of transacting, and it's also voluntary. And I think that's why it's so important.
The cypherpunks were, I guess you could say, a bunch of really paranoid nerds. They saw the power of the internet and these new communications technologies and all of the great things that could be done with them, but they also saw the dark side. They saw the potential dystopian nightmare that it could occur if all of the world's communications and all of the world's finance were happening transparently on a network that could be easily surveilled by state actors and other powerful organizations. And they realized that, as more and more aspects of your life were put out onto this transparent network, it would be easier for various organizations to subjugate and control those aspects of your life. And so as a result, they felt like, we needed to push for better privacy on this network in order for people to have more freedom, in order for us to be able to communicate with people without fear of political repercussions, in order for us to be able to interact economically with people without fear of censorship because our economic transactions are not approved by some authority. It was really about freedom. As privacy and freedom are kind of two sides to the same coin.
A lot of people who really believe in the government's role in growing the pie, or the fallacy of the government's role in growing the pie, don't understand the power and the fact that it really is the Cypherpunk Manifesto that led to the creation of HTTPS, which is your ability to securely enter credit card information on the web, which is what created Amazon and created Uber and all the other services that we take for granted today. And so without the cypherpunk movement driving people to understand that we need that level of self-sovereignty on the internet, we wouldn't be where we are today. And to me, that's not scary. That's something we should all be embracing. And the true meaning of the cypherpunk movement, it's not to overthrow governments. It's about self-sovereignty. When you look at it from the right perspective, things make a lot more sense.
This is a very interesting new experiment because we essentially get to take politics and try to turn it into code. We get to try to reach out and find the human consensus for something and build this layer of machine consensus that automates it.
So this is software that creates, we now know, the hardest money that's ever been created. So why do we need hard money? And we need it to trade. We need it to trade in a way that promotes harmony.
Right.
Because right now, all the soft money and the fiat money is producing, trading, creating disharmony or discord or conflict.
Right.
So
and
this
then,
is a great
again, the software, I mean, the Bitcoin is open, free software. And Cypherpunk's motto is Cypherpunks write code. They don't really trying to change things. So, Adam Back, who is the inventor of Hashcash, who was cited in Satoshi's white paper, he described the cypherpunks as a state of mind, and it's a proactive approach to social changes. And instead of basically petitioning or asking for permission for changes, cypherpunks write code and bring changes. And then what kind of changes they make? They are interested in securing our right to free speech and securing our right to privacy again. So yeah, it's a code that basically embodies these words that were spoken by Thomas Jefferson back in 1776. And now we have a means to actually embody these words into codify them into law, and that's Bitcoin.
My body told me that I belonged with the boys, but my thoughts, my mind was saying that I belonged with the girls.
Transgender surgery starts to be very popular for both persons and doctors.
I was born a male, had a sex change when I was 30 years old. I've now been living as a woman for 28 years, and I fully regret this.
My problems should have gone away by now, but they hadn't.
So these surgeries are nothing more than plastic surgery. I've had several female to male friends, and you look at it and you just go, oh God, you paid for that. It's horrible.
Nobody can change genders. It's impossible. It's delusional. It's a mental illness.
This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man.
But MIT's Khaled Al-Hateb International Memorial Awards 2019 are now open for entries. All media professionals are eligible, whether you're a freelance journalist, work for alternative media, or a part of a global news platform. To participate, send us your published works in video or written format. Go to award.rt.com and enter now.
You can't divorce Bitcoin from the environment in which it was birthed, not only from the cypherpunks and their battles against the US government in terms of privacy, but then here in the actual birth of Bitcoin itself between October 31st, 2008 and January 3rd, 2009, when the first block was mined. In that period of time, we saw a run on the bank in the United Kingdom, Northern Rock. It collapsed. The Chancellor stepped in and bailed that bank out. Then, January 3rd, 2009, the Chancellor, Gordon Brown, was on the brink of second bailout for banks. Remember, only a few months earlier, September 15th, 2008, is when Lehman Brothers collapsed. The global fiat money system was on the brink of utter collapse. I don't think most ordinary people understand just how terrifying that system was to that permissioned financial system. The fiat system is permissioned, it's run by the central bank and their member banks. So these member banks were operating a global monetary financial experiment that went awry. The US Federal Reserve Bank began a radical monetary experiment called quantitative easing, whereby they would print out of thin air $600 billion on November 26, 2008, and purchase $600 billion worth of mortgage-backed securities from their member banks.
Quantitative easing was simply the relabeling of an idea that had been around for quite some time. It was a radical rebranding of money printing, and that's been tried many times throughout history. And we know from history that all money printing, all fiat money, all goes to a price point called zero. There is no escape.
Understanding the history of money was probably the big study that we entered after reading Satoshi's white paper, that we started to ask ourselves, so how many US dollars are in circulation? And then you realize we don't know. And then you dig into who the Federal Reserve is and who runs the Federal Reserve and who did Ben Bernanke, when he was running the Federal Reserve, who does he respond to? And does the president respond to Ben Bernanke, or does Ben Bernanke control the president?
It was radical on November 26, 2008, for the U.S. Federal Reserve to print $600 billion uniquely only for their member banks, in that it was a let them eat cake moment. Here they were saying, yes, we brilliant economists at the Federal Reserve Bank know history. We know what happened before the French Revolution. We know what happens when you just throw fiat brioche to the people and cause massive wealth and income gaps.
Yeah, like I say about quantitative easing, it's all zeros and no ones. There's no code. It's just zeros. It's just more nothing. Zeros. As far as the end I can see, it's nothing there, right? At least with zeros and ones, there's code. There's a finite end to it. It's an algorithm. It's a routine. It repeats. It's not infinite.
We started thinking about things like in Argentina when they went through hyperinflation, how the price of milk would change multiple times a day. We saw what recently happened in Venezuela when they instituted socialism and what happens with hyperinflation there. And understanding the geopolitical landscape of the world to start saying, oh, wait, so if the US dollar is no longer backed by gold, then it's possibly backed by bullets. And oil is backed by the US dollar. Multiple currencies of the other governments are backed by the US dollar. And the US dollar is backed by nothing but belief. All of a sudden, you start paying attention to the geopolitical landscape in a whole different way, where the underlying thing that Bitcoiners are thinking about is money.
As you'll see, quantitative easing and Bitcoin evolution happen hand in hand. They work together.
Well, so Bitcoin, of course, is the answer to massive fiat fraud. And they've simply tried to paper over all their problems and fraud and wars and malfeasance And you can't do that with Bitcoin. So it's a great equalizer in that sense, and it's the gavel of justice. Forget about all the social justice movement. This is the punchline. This is the period on the exclamation.
Bitcoin is the solution. It is the only option that we have outside of the current financial system. This is the only monetary system outside of the state that is viable, in my opinion, and this will continue again into the future. So it's very, very important that people ask why Bitcoin. And why Bitcoin? Because this is the time. This is now, we have now the technology. The time is right. It is now time to execute and finally provide an option and exit to the current financial system.
So January 3rd, 2009 was the Genesis block. January 12th, 2009 was the first Bitcoin transaction. The first transaction of Bitcoin currency in block 170 takes place between Satoshi and Hal Finney, a developer and cryptographic activist.
Right, well, this is Columbus discovering the new world, the Apollo 11 landing on the moon, Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier. This is the first implementation of this paradigm-shifting technology that transforms economics and finance in a heartbeat.
And this was just a pure transaction without consideration of price or profit or reward or when Lambo. It was just pure experimentation, two cryptographic activists, as they call it in here, or two cryptographers, two developers working together to build the system.
You couldn't move digital scarcity up until that point on the internet. It was considered an impossibility. And this disproved that theory and proved you could move digital scarcity. And digital scarcity before this was considered an impossibility. This proved you could have digital scarcity. And this set in motion then this new paradigm, this new epoch, this new era that has gotten everyone tied up in traditional finance and legacy finance and the old banking system.
Now, we don't enter the Bitcoin story until the next episode, after 2010. But in 2009, there were very few people involved, and they were the sorts of people like Hal Finney, like Jeff Garzik, like Peter Todd, the hardcore coders, programmers, participants in an experiment, coming together in an open source project, developing something radical.
It was a science experiment. I mean, we're trying to do something new, right? And the people who had been working on this, people like Adam Back that Satoshi had emailed before he released the protocol. I mean, he'd been working on digital currencies like 20 years earlier with DigiCash. I'd been in virtual currencies, you know, through online games like when I was in middle school, like in the mid-90s. So I'd been doing, you know, I'd been in virtual currencies for a long time. And so, but it started as a collectible because Satoshi and Hal Finney had it. You know, they had just mined like the first couple blocks. And then Satoshi sent Hal some Bitcoins, and it's a collectible. And then like within a week, like somebody set up an exchange where you could actually trade Bitcoins for dollars. And so that began to establish an exchange rate ratio. So it was very early in the process of Bitcoin that it jumped from collectible to exchangeable good. So the idea of using this protocol as money was there right in the beginning.
So it has mimicked the history of gold becoming money
just
in
much
a very
faster.
short period of time.
Very
so
fast.
It took thousands of years.
With
It's taken
gold,
essentially 10 years.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, with Bitcoin, in 10 years, it's gone from like nothing, basically, to $65 billion market cap that's moving hundreds of thousands of transactions a day and settling billions of dollars. I mean, it's a huge, huge deal now. It's shaken the establishment of the planet to the core.
In 2009, it was highly experimental. Nobody was looking for a Lambo. Nobody was, you know, looking to get wrecked. Everybody was designing a new monetary system. Everybody was free to experiment. Everybody was free to fail, those participants in it. And most people today will think of Bitcoin and think of the price and only think about the price and how much it's worth. But October 5th, 2009 was the very first price for Bitcoin. October 5th, 2009, first price published by New Liberty Standard, and it was $1 equals 1,309.03 BTC. And again, in terms of monetary experiments, by this time, the US Federal Reserve had already printed over $600 billion for their member banks and their permissioned network, the U.S. Treasury had printed another $700 billion in TARP. So in the context of monetary experiments and the monetary system in which we live, that's not even, it still has not hit $1 million market cap Bitcoin at this point, 10 months into it.
At that point, it is a germ, one germ, ready to unleash a plague of adoption. It's basically the first sighting of gunpowder on the war field, on the battlefield. You know, it's the first fleck of dust on an avalanche that's ready to explode. You know, this is to the Forex market at this point what a single grain of sand would be to the combined tonnage of sand on the global beaches. Completely and utterly insignificant, except that it contains the code to transform global finance.
There is a lot embedded into Bitcoin from many different disciplines, not just the computer science and the thermodynamics, but also in terms of the game theory and the economics. And all of this crafted in a way that it would accomplish a particular type of human action or behavior. And so, while we don't know exactly the purpose in Satoshi's heart, it does seem from the code and from the actions that have taken place that Satoshi was after monetary sovereignty for the individual, very much like our founding fathers were by including the gold clauses in the U.S. Constitution.
December 30th, 2009, the difficulty increases. The first difficulty increase occurs at 06:11:04 GMT.
It's the invisible hand built into the protocol. And so the entire ecosystem of Bitcoin is contained within the transaction, within the code, within the protocol. And the difficulty adjustment is there to enact game theory.
And game theory brings in all the people that Bitcoin needs to continue to survive and thrive. It brings in the users, it brings in the miners, it brings in the speculators, it brings in the coders, it brings in the nodes, it brings all of them in, and we need that to survive, and it happens.
So you get these miners trying to compete with each other for more Bitcoin, and thus increasing hash rate, which increases security. They'll never win that race, just like nobody ever wins game theory. That's the point of game theory, but they won't stop trying.
So this is the beginning of the hash rate increasing, the difficulty increasing, the competition for scarce resources, i.e. Bitcoin, for scarce Bitcoin to begin, and thus sets in all that follows.